The purpose of the Global CFO Council is to provide an educational and networking forum for senior financial executives in order to share best practices, discuss current financial issues, and to learn about current topics related to the performance of their jobs.
Whitney and Peter, did Terry, team member at Cherry Becker, let you know how I do the introductions? Did she tip you off?
No, she let it be a mystery.
That's so awesome. This is the best. Okay. Good. So I don't read bios. Thank you for sending them to me. That's lame. What I do is I search the interwebs and I just find stuff on the internet about you. And then I reveal it before you begin to speak. So I love it because it usually really stresses out the millennials. And because they put too much on the internet. But Whitney, you're lucky. I did not find much on you. So this is
by design.
Yeah, I know. This is a little bit weak and a little bit light, but let's get started. Whitney Ferguson, manager at Cherry Becker and the TAG Group, and also program manager at the Innovation Fund. So you got two roles. Are you getting paid twice?
Unfortunately, no.
That's lame. I'm going to talk to somebody about that. Before that, I think you were a professional mortgage company professional at Q10 Capital.
Mm-hmm. Nailed it.
And I believe you got your bachelor's degree in finance, financial management, emphasis in real estate, and a minor in accounting from Clemson University.
Yep.
And a master's in real estate development from Clemson University. From Asheville, live in Greenville, South Carolina now. Fellow Jeep owner, and when you were in college, I think you were a member of these super exciting clubs like USB or USGBC, which is green and LEED buildings, which is like eco-friendly buildings. The ULI Urban League Institute, UCSC International Council of Shopping Centers, and the Appraisal Institute. That sounds like some serious partying, and you were in college. So that's why you got good grades, is you remember those amazing clubs. Peter, you're next. Peter, senior manager at Cherry Becker and the TAG Group, TAG Advantage Group. Is that correct, sir?
That is.
I think you got your undergraduate degree in English from the Citadel.
I did.
A JD, USC School of Law. Is that correct?
That's it.
Master's in tax from the University of Denver, because you clearly like to go to school.
Yeah, it was more a master's in skiing with a minor in tax, but yeah.
I think that you are a soccer player / coach, and you used to run track in high school. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And I think that you not only have good hair now, is that you had good hair in high school. Is this you, sir? Is this your senior picture, sir?
It is. You'll notice I've dyed it now, but that is me.
Peter, no bald man wants to hear a man with a full head of hair complain about it being gray. Okay? Whitney, you can take the screen back over so we don't have to stare at Peter's perfect hair for the next 50 minutes. And Peter, last note here is looks like you are super active in the community, chairman of the Housing Authority in Greenville, South Carolina, volunteer at the Makers Collective and the Salvation Army. And I didn't do it. But I think I should have played some Imagine Dragons and some Lenny Kravitz as your kickoff music. I think you're a fan.
It's been a long time since I posted that information on the Tax Advantage Group website, but quality digging there, Robert.
Yeah, people don't put things on the internet that you don't want me to share later on. Well, I am super excited about just to learn about this subject. I'm going to be quiet now. Whitney and Peter, I yield the floor to you, and then I'll pitch you guys some questions when we get to stopping points. Thank you so much.
Perfect. So, Whitney, we can jump off and get started, and we will skip our usual introductions of ourselves, but I will introduce Tax Advantage Group by Cherry Becker. Tax Advantage Group has been around since 2004. We were acquired by Cherry Beckert almost a year ago, have really enjoyed joining forces with them and expanding our network. But as an organization, we have primarily focused on new market tax credit finance, doing a lot of different things. We've produced applications winning over $1 billion in allocation, which will mean something to you by the end of this. Hopefully, we've helped place or deploy $780 million worth of new market tax credit financing. And we manage or have managed through our compliance and asset management department just a little over $500 million in assets for reporting and compliance purposes. We're pretty excited to say that we've created over 14,000 direct jobs, over 500,000 people have received community services through projects we've financed. And we've developed over 7.1 million square feet of real estate as a tax advantage group organization. And then on the Innovate Fund side, Whitney.
Yeah, so as Robert mentioned at the top, my primary role is managing the day-to-day operations of an entity called the Innovate Fund. Cherry Beckert owns a minority ownership interest in the Innovate Fund, and the Innovate Fund is a certified community development entity, or CDE, and we will talk a lot about what CDEs are throughout the presentation, but essentially they are the groups that actually do new market tax credit lending. And so the Innovate Fund has a mission of providing access to capital in the form of loans to projects and businesses within a 4-state service area. And those 4 states are Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. And we focus that capital on projects that are going to either create quality jobs or increase health and wellness outcomes within those 4 states. And to date, we have secured and deployed $277 million of new market tax credit allocation. And with that, we've been able to fund projects that have created over 6,000 jobs, serve almost 70,000 people through additional access to community goods and services, and construct or rehab about 2.4 million square feet of real estate.
All right, so now we're actually going to talk about the topic for today. Hope everybody's in and settled in and ready to go. So new markets tax credits are a federal subsidy designed to stimulate investment in low-income communities. It's a program that was created, bipartisan program created in 2000 by statute, and by 2004 we finally had regs to get into actually closing financing transactions. It's administered by a department of the Treasury you may have never heard of called the CDFI Fund. It's a public-private partnership between the government and, as Whitney said, community development entities, which are private organizations deploying capital with the program. Application program, and there's a finite supply of credits in any given year. But again, the federal government, basically, this is a corollary to the low-income housing tax credit. They saw great success in investment in housing in low-income communities through the use of the LIHTC credit, but they realized that if you give people a nice place to live, but they still don't have access to jobs, services, goods, or other community assets, then they really haven't had a substantial change and can't see that upward progression into wealth that the government was trying to stimulate. So they created the New Market Tax Credit Program to attract and retain a skilled workforce, drive capital investments to underserved communities, and through that bring new goods and services and jobs into those communities. It's been very successful at that. It gets about an 8x return on the government's dollar to total growth in those communities when it's deployed correctly. Next slide, Whitney. And so we like to get to the punchline first on this because we're going to drone through some pretty boring details for a few minutes here coming up. And so the punchline is, if you're undertaking a capital project, New Markets tax credits can bring 17 to 20% of the total capital for that project to your spend, reducing your capital or borrowing needs to complete your project. The way the financing works is an investor buys tax credits and pairs that money with your 80 to 83% of the total project costs to cover complete construction or acquisition costs. In addition to bringing capital to the program, it brings other flexible benefits. The program is set up for a 7-year period, and the money comes in on day one as debt, typically 0% interest and interest only for that 7 years. So that is subordinated debt at a very low interest rate with interest only terms for 7 years. And at the end of the program, you typically do not repay that loan. And so while you get your cash, your 17 to 20% cash up front, you get a balance sheet cleanup in year 8.
All right, and so this slide kind of gets at how exactly the program works and how the money actually gets from the Department of Treasury all the way down to our project sponsor. So you've already heard us mention community development entities or CDEs a bunch of times already. We will keep doing that. But CDEs are one of the most important pieces of the new market tax credit world. And that is because they are the only entities allowed to apply for and win the authority to sell new markets tax credits. So CDEs apply for these once every year. They submit a really long application to the CDFI fund. There are just over 200 active CDEs across the country. I think for the last application round, I think 206 applications were received. And in a given year, only about a third of them will win. So it's competitive for CDEs to secure the allocation on the front end. Once a CDE has secured that allocation from the CDFI fund, hopefully they've been doing a good job of maintaining a strong pipeline of potential qualified projects within their service area. And they will start deciding which of those projects are ready to move forward, and they will chunk up their larger allocation amount into smaller pieces to put on specific projects. And then moving down to that blue box, once the CDE has decided to put allocation on a project, it will then go out and sell those tax credits to an institutional investor. Those are typically the sort of 7 to 8 or 9 largest national banks. So Bank of America, Wells Fargo, PNC, all of those folks buy these credits. And then the CDE will take the cash proceeds they get in exchange for those tax credits and then invest it into qualified projects. And as Pete mentioned, that's typically going to take the form of a low or no interest rate convertible loan. So a little bit more about what CDEs are, because we know that they're really important to the program. By statute, they have to be private for-profit entities, and they also must have a mission of serving low-income communities. There are lots of ways that CDEs achieve that mission, but that's the core of what CDEs have to do in order to be certified by the CDFI fund. And they can be affiliates of governmental agencies or municipalities. A lot of cities or counties own CDEs. Some are affiliates of banks. So a lot of those banks that I talked about that buy the tax credits also have their own CDEs and will play on both sides of a new markets transaction. And then they can also be affiliates of both private, for-profit and nonprofit entities. So the Innovate Fund, for example, we have a majority owner that's a nonprofit, and then we have Terry Becker that is our minority owner, which is obviously a for-profit entity. And then every CDE is going to have its specific geographic service area that it can lend into. We've already talked about for the Innovate Fund, that's a 4-state service area. But CDE service areas can be as small as a single county, or as large as the entire nation, or any combination of multiple states within that. And then they're also going to have, each one is going to have its specific community outcomes that it's trying to achieve. And those can really run the gamut as well, from job creation projects to expanded access to community goods and services. There are some CDEs that focus only on alternative and green energy projects, some focused on brownfield redevelopments. Really, you can find a CDE that's doing pretty much almost anything these days. And so the hard part about securing new market tax credit allocation is, number one, finding the CDEs that can lend within the area that your project is going to be located in, and then narrowing that down a little bit more based off which CDEs match the community outcomes your project is going to be created. And we've got a link down there to the CDFI Fund's website where you can find a list of the CDEs that are out there and what their service areas are. So typically, if folks have heard one thing about new markets, usually the first thing is that they're really complicated. The second thing folks have heard is that projects have to be located in specific areas in order to qualify for the program. So in order for a project to geographically qualify for the program, it needs to be located in a low-income community or an LIC. And the definition of an LIC is a census tract. So the whole thing is based on census tracts. A census tract that exhibits a poverty rate that is 20% or greater, or median family income that is 80% or less than the area or statewide average. And I know there's a lot of data points on this slide. You don't have to commit them to memory. There are mapping tools that exist on the internet where you can enter in the address of the project and it will give you a yes or a no. Alternatively, if you just want to email Pete or I the address, we can look that up really quickly. And in addition to giving you just a yes, it's qualified, or a no, it's not qualified, we can sort of talk about if it is qualified, if it also hits some of these additional buckets that I'm going to talk about that might make it more attractive in the new markets industry. So there's a difference between just being in a qualified census tract and being in what the industry calls a higher distress census tract. And the importance of that is CDEs, when they win their allocation from Treasury, most of them commit to spending 75% of that allocation in higher distress census tracts. So if you can find a project in one of these higher distress census tracts, it kind of gets bumped up to the top of a CDE's priority list. And as you can imagine, to qualify as higher distress, that 20% poverty gets ratcheted up to 30%. The median family income gets ratcheted down from 80% to 60%. You can also meet that test if your census tract has an unemployment rate that is at least 1.5 times the national average. And then there's a secondary list, and we don't list them out here. I think it's 17 or 18 items long, but it's things like FEMA disaster areas, brownfields, federal, state, or local economic incentive zones, opportunity zones were recently added to the list. If you can hit 2 of those secondary characteristics, that'll also get you into that severe distressed bucket.
Yeah, and Whitney, I would say that that is definitely something that you guys can feel free to email us, and we can look those secondary characteristics up for you, because the data points come from a million different places. So feel free to send us an address if you have a question.
And very important point, Pete. So then there are also a couple of targeted geographies that are really important for new markets as well. The reason these are important, CDEs, when they apply, they get the option of checking a couple of different boxes. One is for non-metropolitan counties, one is for underserved states. If they check that box on their application, they'll also put a percentage in of their allocation that they would be willing to obligate to those specific geographies. And if they win, they actually have to deploy it that way. It doesn't help them win, but if they do win, it helps them win a larger allocation amount. So a lot of CDEs will check either one or both of these boxes. So for non-metropolitan counties, those get defined for new markets purposes as counties that are not attached to metropolitan statistical areas. Again, if you think your area is rural, it might not count as non-metro for new markets purposes. And feel free to email Peter and I, and we can get you a definitive answer on that. The second targeted geography is called underserved states. And this is a list that the CDFI Fund puts out each year of the 10 states that have received the least amount of new market tax credit allocation on a per capita basis. Originally, this did not exist in the new markets world, but once the program had been around for a while and the CDFI Fund was actually looking at the disbursement of the new market tax credit subsidies, what they found was some states were getting like $800 of allocation per capita, and other states were getting like $10 of allocation per capita. So there was a really big discrepancy. And so they're trying to incentivize CDEs to lend into the states that have received fewer new market tax credit allocation dollars. So if we've got the list of the current 10 states, it changes every year, but usually about 1, maybe 2 states will drop out and 1 or 2 get added back in. It doesn't change wholesale. And so if you've got a project that is either underserved state, it will get bounced up to the top of a lot of CDEs lists. Or if you've got one that's non-metro, same thing. If you can find a project that's both non-metro and in an underserved state, it's even better. And then I'll talk a little bit about what types of projects usually get funded with new markets. So there's really only a short list of end users that are prohibited from using the program. It's things like alcohol stores, massage parlors, gambling facilities, the usual types of things that you would imagine a federal program would not want to be funded. But other than that, the new market tax credit industry has done a pretty good job of figuring out how to fund most types of projects. Although there are some categories of projects that get funded more often than others. And so you've heard Pete and I talk a good bit about job creation projects. So a lot of manufacturing and industrial projects receive new market tax credit funding. And that's mostly due to, usually they're creating a pretty high number of jobs. Usually those jobs have full-time working hours, decent wages, health benefits, retirement benefits, and typically most of those jobs are accessible to folks living in low-income areas that may not have more than a high school diploma. In the real estate and construction sector, we see a good number of grocery-anchored retail projects, especially if those projects are located in a food desert and you're bringing grocery to that food desert. We see a lot of mixed-use buildings as well. Another big category, as you could imagine, are community services. Things like hospitals, health clinics are obviously really big within the industry. And then we've educational facilities as well, so charter schools, public and private schools. And then in the nonprofit sector, pretty much any nonprofit that's bringing additional access to community goods and services to low-income people have a pretty easy time in new markets. We see a lot of YMCAs, Boys and Girls Clubs, food banks, all sorts of projects like that. And then the last thing that I always like to touch on this slide, because usually folks really understand that new markets are good to use with new construction and real estate projects, but it can also do machinery and equipment only deals or operating business deals. So you can use new markets to acquire another business. And that's something that folks don't always realize that new markets can do. And typically we're looking at projects that are at least $5 million in total project costs and up.
And Whitney, the only other thing I would say is when you're looking at acquisitions or expansions and things like that, you can also include up to a year's worth of working capital if you've got a cash flow shortfall for that year while you're ramping up your new manufacturing site or your acquired business that you're having to retool or whatever. You can add working capital to your project size.
Also very good points. So this, I won't speak too much about this slide. It's pretty self-explanatory. We just put it in here to sort of give you a visual of the different types of projects that have been funded with new markets. In the green for all years that the program has been in existence, and the orange just for fiscal year 2017, which is the last year that we have data from the CDFI fund on. All right, and I believe this is our breaking point for us to take a few questions if we've got some.
That was awesome, and I have a question. If you could flip to the previous slide, it looked like CDEs were one of the types of businesses. So, can you use this program to establish a CDE in a low-income qualifying area?
So it's not used so much to establish a CDE, but within the application, there are a list of, I think, 5 innovative investments that CDEs are incentivized to try to do. One of them is trying to fund projects under $5 million. One of them is spending your allocation, giving it to another CDE that's already in existence, but maybe hasn't won an allocation yet. And so you could give that CDE, 10 million of your allocation, and then they could run it down to a project as a way to get CDEs that don't have a lot of experience in the program, a way to get that experience.
It's kind of a technical assistance program.
Yeah. That's fascinating. All right, we do have some questions. I'm going to hit you rapid fire. One question from a couple slides ago was, are all states in the federal program? Is there a service area that covers every part of the U.S.? And are there any state programs that have been created to kind of work with the federal program?
Yeah, so yes and yes. As I'll talk about the state programs. There are 10 or 15 states that have had or are currently considering legislation to have state new markets tax credits. They typically mirror the federal credit and provide an additional subsidy. They can be paired together with the federal credit in those states, although they're typically a little bit thinner subsidy and a little bit smaller in scope than the federal program. And Whitney, you want to talk about locations?
Yeah, so yes, there are CDEs that cover all 50 states, as well as Puerto Rico and Guam and the Virgin Islands, I believe. A lot of the larger CDEs have national service areas, so they'll cover every part of the United States.
Question number 2 is, do you have to be a US-based business to apply and benefit from this program?
You do not. The project's physical location has to be located within the United States. And we'll talk about a project when we talk about a few project examples later on in the presentation. One of them that the Innovate Fund did was actually a Chinese-owned firm that expanded their U.S. headquarters here in South Carolina back in 2015.
It was fun watching the attorneys figure out how to give an opinion about the corporate law statute of a document written in Mandarin Chinese. So.
Another question is, do you have to, as part of the application, the business, if you have the business for sure, you have the location for sure, to start the process, do you have to have a completely defined project in mind, or can you begin the project before that part?
So I would answer that question. You can have a completely defined project in mind and new markets can jump right in, or you can have a project where you've identified the location, but you're still in the very early stages of scoping and you don't know whether it's going to be an $8 million investment or a $30 million investment. It's not too early to start investigating new markets.
And I've got this question like 4 times, so you know you got some accountants on the call, is when you spoke about the CDFI loan and that there was the opportunity for forgiveness, I think in year 7 or 8, upon forgiveness, is that a taxable event?
It is if you're a for-profit entity.
Oh.
Go.
Yeah, but the short answer is it is a taxable event if you're a for-profit entity. Obviously, for our nonprofit borrowers and clients, they don't so much have to worry about that.
This slide that we're on, healthcare and social assistances, for 17 was the largest in all years, one of the largest. Can you dig into that a little bit? What qualifies as healthcare and social assistance? What are the big buckets in that?
Yeah, so that's a really big bucket. That includes traditional healthcare, hospitals, medical clinics, federally qualified health centers, dental. But it also includes in social assistance, I'm just looking to make sure, organizations that probably includes things like women's shelters, men's shelters, other mental health type programs that may not be actual health care but are health related, or providing social support services. Could be financial advisory services for people who are trying to figure out how to balance a budget, or they're trying to come out of poverty and learning how to manage a checkbook and that sort of thing would fall under that as well.
And you, a couple slides ago, you had a link at the bottom of the slide that you could click on to find more information about the locations that qualify, and I believe it was the CDEs that represent that service area. And was that the link to use that had the ability to filter? You spoke about you don't have to figure this out and go to the library and look on microfiche. There was Whitney might not even know what that is, that reference, actually. I'm sorry, Whitney. There's a physical building used to go and used to move. No. Was that the link that we should click to dig a little deeper on when we have questions about location?
So I think that was the link just to the CDFI Fund's website. And if it is, then yes, you should be able to, on that website, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, there will be a button called SIMPS mapping tool. You can click on that, and then it'll bring up a mapping tool. You can just enter the address in of your project, and it will give you some information. It might be a little bit user unfriendly, so anybody that's trying to get there but can't quite figure it out, just shoot Peter or I an email, and we can help you out with that. Or also, if you just Google, New Market Tax Credit mapping tools into Google, you might be able to find some more that are
Last question for here, and I'll hold the rest for the next stopping point. Is this permanently approved with permanent funding, or is there an annual funding process?
So it's not permanently approved. When it was originally approved in the early 2000s, it got approved for a 5-year authorization. Then the program spent probably 5 or 6 or 7 years where in December of every year, we were just crossing our fingers that we got added to the tax extenders bill that year for another 1-year authorization. A while back, we got another 5-year authorization. That was nice. Then we went back to that 1 year at a time. This past December, though, in the big COVID relief package that was passed right at the end of December, I think it was signed into law on December 27th, that included another 5-year authorization for the program.
And just yesterday, they filed another permanency request bill. So we'll see where that one goes, but it gets filed every time there's a new Congress established. We have sponsors who file the permanency bill.
Great, thank you. I'm going to hold the rest of the questions to the next stopping point. Thank you so much.
All right, so just to kind of recap, what makes a good New Markets tax credit project is kind of a mix of things. First, it's got to be located in a qualifying census tract, preferably a severely distressed or a higher distressed census tract, with one of those 3 major categories being really bad or 2 of those minor categories being met. Second, community impact. When the program first got started, it really was a great idea with very little definition. Over the years, as it's progressed and become more and more competitive and more participants have joined in and really gotten down to very fine lines between winners and losers in terms of CDEs getting allocation each year in order to finance projects, they have become very adept at measuring outcomes. So you're going to want to have a project that has a clearly defined, easily measurable community outcome or community outcomes. So if you're thinking about the manufacturing world, you're going to create X number of new jobs, retain Y number of existing jobs, and they're going to pay a wage that's higher than the living wage, higher than the per capita income for the community. It has healthcare. We've got this training program, that internship program, this connectivity to a community college or a high school graduation program, some set of defined characteristics. In the social service setting, it might be, we're going to expand our hospital and create an extra 50 beds that are going to allow us to see an extra 500 patients a year, or some other version of that. But you're going to want to have clearly identifiable. When we first got started, we would tell these stories about, if you fund this program, we're going to make awesome, good stuff happen in communities. And that was enough. And now you really need to define what that awesome, good stuff is. Additionally, you need to have a but-for analysis. So this is a pretty thin subsidy at 17 to 20%. It's very competitive. And so they want to know that their money is kind of the reason you were able to move forward. So in the nonprofit world, that's almost always really easy. You go, hey, it's a $10 million project. Our capital campaign only raised 8. We need 2. In the manufacturing world, it doesn't have to be that easy. Or in the real estate development world, it doesn't have to be that easy, because sometimes you could find capital. There's always another mezzanine lender or a hard money debt person who will get you the extra $500,000 you need or extra $1 million you need. But the financial model still doesn't make any sense to do that. So when you think about a larger manufacturing company, maybe it costs more to locate, slightly more to locate in non-metro South Carolina than it does in somewhere in Mexico. But if you can get a new market tax credit subsidy to reduce your capital spend, your capital per widget produced goes down and becomes more competitive with that overseas location. Or if you're in South Carolina, you're always worried it's going to end up in Alabama and vice versa. But you can use stories like that to tell your but-for story instead of just, oh, well, we couldn't scrape together an extra $2 million. So lots of different ways to come at it, but you want to have some reason why, without new market subsidy, the project either couldn't move forward or couldn't achieve the greatness it would achieve if it did get the new market tax credit financed. And then finally, there's project timing. So we work on a cycle where CDEs are applying right now in the fall for more allocation, and they have to produce a pipeline of example projects that, if they won, they would fund stuff like what they've written into their application. Not necessarily those projects, because you never know what's going to be available 9 months later when the announcement finally comes out. Did that project actually get its other capital raised? Did they decide to hold off on their development? Did they decide to move forward without new markets? But there's that representative pipeline of projects. So you're talking to the CDEs and saying, hey, I've got this great project I'd like you to finance. And for example, Whitney right now at the Innovate Fund doesn't have any allocation. So she's probably going to tell you, man, that's a cool project. I love it. If I win in April or May or June or July or whenever Treasury finally announces, I'd love to finance it. Call me back. And then you call her a month later and say, hey, do you have any money now? And she says, no. You call and, hey, do you have any money? She's like, no. And then one day she picks up the phone and calls you and says, hey, I got money today. Can you close tomorrow? And so in the meantime, you've kind of got to be moving through your development steps to be ready to close on the project. So that's designs in place, site control of the real estate, phase 1's done if you're doing real estate type project. All of those things you would naturally need if you were getting bank finance to close the deal, because as soon as she gets money, she's going to want to be out of money again. And in fact, when they get money, they have tranches they have to get out in quick periods of time. So there's this weird timing dance where you have to move forward like there's going to be new markets available, or you're going to be able to finance the project some other way while you're waiting on the CDEs. And then when they come, you've got to be ready to go, because if you're not, they'll go, all right, cool, I'm going to put you in my application for next year, and I'm going to call the next one on the list and the next one on the list. So there's a little bit of a dance there around timing that we can help you with, but you've got to kind of always be aware of that in the background. So that's a good new markets project. Now let's talk about what makes a great new markets project. We've said a number of times these are competitive financing programs. And so you want to have not just a nice Rolex watch, but you want to have the one with the diamonds encrusted around the sides and the emeralds on the second hand as it moves around. You want to have the really fancy one that everybody wants. And the way you do that is you start to layer together some of these things. You start with, it's a good project. I've got measurable community outcomes. I'm in a low income census tract, all of that sort of thing. And then how can I make it stand out? What can I do to layer things? Well, first, if I'm in an underserved state, if I have a choice between putting it in Georgia or South Carolina, I'm kind of on the borderline. Maybe I'm in Georgia, and that makes me an underserved state project. Then is it non-metro? That's another bonus point that people have buckets they have to spend in. So if you can fall into that bucket, great. If you can't, it's okay. We finance a ton of projects that aren't in underserved states and aren't non-metro, but those are the sort of bonus points you can get. And then, am I actually ready to close? Can I perform on my 80% of the money? Do I have my design work done? We meet with a lot of projects that have hopes and dreams and wishes, but not actual money. And when it comes to new markets, being a gap financing mechanism, they really love your project right up to the point where you say, oh, I need another 6 months to get my money pulled together. And then they love it from afar and they put it at the back of the stack and move forward. And then finally, are you in one of those sort of favored industries that are really making high impacts? In the early days, you could pretty easily finance hospitality, for example. Now that's much harder. If you've got the right story, Whitney and I have both financed hotel projects, but they're not just a Quality Inn on the corner of I-95 and XYZ Road on the edge of Columbia. They are special purpose. They've got a story to tell. They're revitalizing a part of a neighborhood, like in Spartanburg, where we did the AC Hotel, or in Bristol, Virginia, where we put the first hotel in a building that had been abandoned for 20 years, the first hotel in downtown Bristol in 20 years. So, you can get non-favored industries financed, but if you're in a favored industry, manufacturing, healthcare, social services, you've got a complete capital stack in a non-metro area in an underserved state, now the sky's kind of the limit for you. And so any way you can layer those things that we've talked about as being important together helps your project become a great project. So now let's give you some actual non-abstract, concrete examples of projects. And each of these had at least one of those little, what makes it a great project. So 100 Prince Avenue in Athens, Georgia is a mixed use project. That building you see, that's a nice rendering. The building's still under construction. But that had, I think it was 80 or 65 housing units, apartments in it. 10 of those are affordable. Put in a 12,000 square foot urban grocery store. A Piggly Wiggly Express is going in there. And that's in a food desert in Athens, Georgia. So the selling points on this are, it was an underserved state. This was the first market rate housing, whether affordable at 80% of median family income or at full market rate, built in Athens in over 12 years. Student housing is a lot more lucrative than regular rental housing. And so that's all that had gone up in downtown Athens. So they desperately needed housing. They desperately needed affordable housing, and they needed grocery in this food desert. That grocery and the related restaurants and stuff that are on the ground floor created 78 jobs, but again, in an underserved state. And then Whitney, you want to talk a little bit about Faith Family?
Yeah, so Faith Family Medical Center, they were a nonprofit group out of Nashville, Tennessee, focused on providing primary medical care and services to working but uninsured and underinsured Tennesseans. And so they used new markets to acquire a piece of property that was adjacent to their existing facility. They constructed a new 17,000 square foot facility, which was pretty much double the size of their original facility. And what it did was allow them to double, in essence, their capacity. So they started serving 8,900 uninsured and underinsured folks per year instead of about 4,300, which was what they were at prior to the new markets transaction. You can see on the slide, they were providing primary medical services in a medically underserved area. That's what MUA stands for. Additionally, they were in Tennessee, which is one of those underserved states. So those are sort of the two high-level hooks that got the CDE that eventually funded the project interested on the front end. And then TDC Cutting Tools, I mentioned this one during the question time. This was a Chinese-owned company. They already had their headquarters, the U.S. headquarters, located in Seneca, South Carolina. That was non-metro, South Carolina. This was one of the projects that I funded at the Innovate Fund. And they wanted to do some rehab in their existing manufacturing building, add a building for their office operations. And then they constructed a second new building because they came up with an idea. So their primary manufacturing service line is creating metal cutting tools. So essentially drill bits, very large ones that drill big oil and gas and water wells, all the way down to the teeny tiny ones that folks use to make iPhones and medical devices. So what they came up with, they got a patent for it. They would take the waste from creating those cutting tools, run it through a centrifuge, and then repurpose it into powdered metal, pack it back down, and put it into new products. So it had a green aspect to it as well. And then I'll pass it back to Pete to talk about Commonwealth Crossing.
Yeah, and so Commonwealth Crossing was a pretty cool project in non-metro Virginia. So again, a non-metro project, workforce development. This was actually a partnership between the Economic Development Authority and the County of Henry County, Virginia. And they built this 25,000 square foot workforce development building in their Commonwealth Crossing mega site. So if you were looking at putting your new industrial facility in the mega site, they would lease it to you for $1 a year, this high bay space. You could put your equipment in, train workers at the expense of the county and the local community college on your equipment, so that when you opened your facility and moved your equipment into that facility, you had a specifically trained workforce, not a generically trained workforce. It's been hugely successful. They opened it and almost immediately occupied it with a glass manufacturer who now has, I don't know, a couple 100,000 square feet of manufacturing space in the mega park. So again, non-metro workforce development project with a tie-in to a community college providing education to people with typically low-skilled laborers left behind when the textile and furniture industries left that part of Virginia. So Whitney, we got about 4 minutes left if we're going to leave a minute or two for questions. So we knew y'all were accountants. We waited till the end to show you the math, or else we'd have never gotten past anything else. So you want to run through real quick how the subsidy math works?
Absolutely. So we're going to use a project example here. It's got $10 million in total project cost. It's already done the heavy lifting of getting a CDE to agree to put $10 million of new market tax credit allocation on the project. The new market tax credit is a 39% tax credit of that allocation amount. So 10 million times 39% generates 3.9 million in actual tax credits. Our CDE is going to take those tax credits. It's going to go sell them to our institutional tax credit investor. We're using 75 cents on the dollar for each dollar of tax credit. The compliance period for the program is 7 years. So that tax credit investor claims the 39% over a 7-year period. So they're going to pay a discounted price. That's probably a little bit higher than where market is right now. But we take our 3.9 million in tax credits, multiply it by 75 cents. That's going to generate about 2.9 million in actual cash equity that's going to come to the CDE. About $1 million is going to come out of that in closing costs and fees. Most of that are CDE fees that are going to get charged upfront at closing, some throughout the 7-year compliance period as the CDE is collecting information from the borrower and doing a lot of asset management to make sure not only is the project still in a good position to make its debt service payments, but also has it done anything to run afoul of any new market tax credit rule or regulation that might cause a recapture of our tax credit investors' tax credits. So once we take $1 million in fees out, we're left with 1.9 million. That would be your net benefit of new markets. So out of 10 million, that hits us right at about 19%. And if you'll remember at the top, we kind of estimate new markets are somewhere between 17 and 20%. Obviously, that spread is a little bit due to tax credit pricing, a little bit due to how efficient you can keep the closing and what fees the CDE is going to charge in the transaction. And then I won't talk too much about this one because I know we're a little bit pushing up on time and we want to make sure that we ask questions. This is just a structure chart of a typical new markets transaction. So we've got the CDFI fund providing our tax credit authority to our CDE in the transaction. We're going to generate our 3.9 million in tax credits. You'll see that going up and to the right to our tax credit investor. They're going to put their 2.9 million of equity into this investment fund box. This box needs 10 million because the transaction that technically generates the tax credits is when this investment fund drops $10 million down to our CDE in the form of a qualified equity investment. So the remainder of that 10 million, that's what our project is responsible for bringing to the table. That can be debt from a bank, sponsor equity, grants and campaign donations and pledges. If you're a nonprofit, you can leverage historic tax credit equity through the new market structure. Wherever you're pulling together the rest of your money, instead of loaning that money directly to your project down here, you're going to loan it to this investment fund box so that we've got 10 million, drops down to our CDE. CDE is going to drop all 10 million of those dollars back down to our project. It's going to do that in 2 loans, and you'll note that a loan matches our leverage loan from the top. So that money just flows through. If you borrowed that 7 million at 5%, you'll get it back at 7 million at 5% at the bottom. Our B note, that's our new market tax credit equity piece. That'll get loaned to you interest only, typically at 0%. So that's the first nugget. You get to borrow $3 million at 0% for 7 years. And then as Pete mentioned at the top, at the end of those 7 years, you can purchase that note for a nominal price, about $1,000, and then you can cancel that debt. And that was as quick as I could do that. Now that was really fast. But we'll take some questions.
Well done. That is some meaty information to cover in that quick of a time. And I'm going to answer question number 1, which is, will this deck be provided? I have some questions. Yes, I'm going to send the deck out. And question number 2 was, can I have Whitney and Peter's contact information for follow-up questions? Answers yes. So tomorrow I'm going to send out a copy of this recording, a copy of the deck, and Whitney and Peter's contact information for follow-up questions. You don't have to go at this alone. Whitney and Peter can be your guide on this sometimes difficult process. Peter and Whitney, question number 1, you've mentioned clearly defined community outcome and community impact. You also talked about recapture of credit, like a clawback. So, because I was thinking, man, could I just make stuff up and lie and then not do anything with the money other than get a cool toupee or something? So how does that work? If you come up with a bunch of stated goals and then don't do anything, what's recapture? What's the clawback?
Yeah, so recapture is a very finite, limited technical breach of the new markets program. So 1, if you move your business or your project that's financed out of a low income census tract, that's a problem. If we talk about these being interest only. If you send any of the principal back during the 7-year period, that creates a recapture. Or if you spend your money on one of those or allow one of those disallowed activities. So let's say you're a mixed use building. This is where the easiest example, and you start out with all these great local shops and local restaurants, but one of them goes bust in year 3. There is always a suntan parlor or somebody like that, or a liquor store that will take a 2,500 square foot slot in a mixed use retail facility. If you were to put one of those in, that would violate and create a recapture event. But this is intended to finance in low-income communities. So if the project goes bankrupt, if you don't hire as many people as you said you were going to, if you don't serve as many low-income service people as you thought you would as a nonprofit, It's sad, it's distressing, but there's no financial penalty tied to that.
For time, I'm going to allow one more question. Can some of the funds for the remainder of the funding of this project be 1031 exchange funds?
Yes, they can't be part of that bucket called leverage lender. They have to go directly into the project. The same thing with opportunity zone funds. And that's just a function of the 1031 rules and the opportunity zone rules, not the new markets rules.
Whitney and Peter, fantastic job. This was excellent information. Amazing that you covered this in an hour. Everyone, I'm going to send the deck. I'm going to send their contact information for follow-up. And feel free to reach out. This is hard, right? You need a guide to go through this. You don't have to go at this alone. And Whitney and Peter, clearly visible experts in this subject. So well done. I love the Cherry Becker team. Great full-service CPA firm. Highly recommend them. And as always, I'm going to post something about how awesome Whitney and Peter and Tag and Cherry Beckert are and put it on LinkedIn. And you could win an amazing basket of swag if you like, comment, and share my post on LinkedIn. And I'll know you did it because I will see your face. So do it. And Whitney and Peter, thank you so much. I hope you get everyone on the call, have a wonderful day.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.